Good afternoon. Okay, thanks. I'll be presenting some initiatives and ideas that we have been working on in Zambia as UNICEF, supporting the Zambian government and working in collaboration with UNU-WIDER. So I start firstly by speaking about why we must invest in children in Zambia and just a bit of an overview. Firstly, 60% of the Zambian population live in poverty. 71% of children are suffering from at least 2 deprivations. For every 100,000 children, there are only 2.4 social workers. And when we look at the budgets as well, we see that only 3% of the national budget goes towards nutrition. For 30% of all new HIV infection among children were from mothers with the incident of HIV infection during pregnancy or breastfeeding. So clearly showing you what the situation looks like around a variety of the important social sectors. And we do have some other deprivations across nutrition and WASH, as well as social insurance. And when we look at where we're coming from, Zambia's social protection expenditure has increased quite significantly over the years. From 2015, where social protection expenditure was at 0.7% of GDP, to 2025, where we saw social protection expenditure rising to about 2%, 1.5% in 2024. And during crises like a drought that we've had more recently, you could see that social protection was the go-to program for the Zambian government in terms of responding to this. This year, the government also launched an ambitious new social protection policy that achieves or attempts to look at a life cycle approach, so potentially broadening coverage for social protection in Zambia. Now, we see that Zambia has quite a number of social protection programs. Expenditure is above average, but when you compare to other countries in the region, you see that this picture here shows that Zambia is currently spreading its resources quite thinly compared to other countries that are running much less social protection programs. So per capita expenditure in dollars, you see for South Africa, around $361. Namibia, there you have $233, Zimbabwe $64, and when you compare that to Zambia, it's just around $42 in terms of per capita expenditure. So again, a sign that even though Zambia has quite a number of comprehensive programs, the resources are being spread a little bit thinly, even though it's slightly above average for the other countries within the Southern African region. And when you come to financing of the social cost transfer, which is the largest social protection program, currently with 1.3 beneficiaries in terms of households, and Zambia's population has around 3 million households. So the program covers basically a third of Zambia's households. When you look at the program, really, it's largely government financed. So from around 2020, the donor component, which is also mostly at the time through a loan, was at around 36%, funded mostly through the World Bank, and that has dropped over the years to just about 18% in 2025. Again, showing that this program, because it's largely funded by government, there is then need to show up fiscal space to ensure that the government sustains or continues to invest in this particular program. And then while we see that in current times, the program has been well funded and execution rates have significantly improved, of course there was political change in Zambia in around 2021, but also in 2020, Zambia was facing a high debt distress and had entered into debt suspension. And so from 2021 and 2020 upwards, Zambia was no longer repaying its debt repayments. But what we see in the years before that is that when debt repayments were quite high, you could see that that pressure was really put on social protection programs, and that resulted in low budget executions. So around 2017, budget execution was just around 60%. 2019 was the worst when donor funding actually reduced. Execution rates here were below 20%. So that again shows that while there's been improvement now, there are still quite significant risks to social protection financing in Zambia. Currently, the government is going through a process of restructuring its debt, and I'll speak to this a little bit later. but we see that there are risks. And so in order to respond and support the government, especially with a new ambitious program, we looked at trying to find some evidence and trying to come up with some strategies to provide support for the government. Now, like I mentioned, historically we've had high debt levels. Repayments currently reduced from 8 billion to 599, so just 600 million, creating some fiscal space, but that was mostly due to restructuring and suspension of these debt repayments. So between 2022 and 2025, over $8 billion became due for debt repayment in Zambia. And like mentioned, there's been very interesting policy shifts. The 2024-2025 social protection policy adopts a life cycle approach, and this potentially could expand social protection coverage across all ages and vulnerability groups. And to respond to this, UNICEF Zambia has been working with the government, firstly by providing thought leadership to the Ministry of Finance and Community Development and Social Services, which is our lead ministry on social protection and social assistance. And part of this for the government has been first to do two ambitious things. One is to create a multi-sectorial technical group that includes a diverse group of stakeholders, not just the stakeholders that traditionally would be involved in social protection, but looking a little bit outside, including the Revenue Authority that you wouldn't see traditionally participating here. Other stakeholders, including the World Bank, the IMF. We know that because Zambia is currently under an IMF program that ends this October, all policy decisions are really closely monitored by the IMF, and so it's been important to basically include that group here. And one of the things that this group is trying to do is to develop a financing strategy that then supports the implementation of this new social protection policy. Now, the first step has been to develop some of the evidence, look at what evidence exists and what options exist for Zambia. And I'll be presenting some of these options here. And then lastly, to then look at where we can take these additional revenues raised from these options. And so this has been in partnership with UNU-WIDER based on various papers that have been put together and will soon be published. So these vary from looking at tax expenditure reviews, looking at potentially introducing a carbon tax, looking at advocating and trying to find more progressive taxation, budget reprioritization, and then lastly to try to simulate these additional resources into areas where they have impact, and this was done through the micro-tax simulation, the micro-ZAMOD that has been developed for Zambia. So I'll quickly run us through some of what this evidence shows. Again, when we looked at the tax gap analysis through some of the evidence, what we see is Zambia still has quite a significant proportion of tax that is not collected. So when we look at the tax gap, it's around 47 to 56%, and that has been growing from 2014 to 2020. You see that the blue line is potentially what could be collected, and the orange line is what is currently being collected. So basically showing you the gap. Corporate tax has the largest gap. Key sectors across mining, construction, manufacturing are where the gaps are. But we also see that sectors with high informality, like the wholesale sector, are also showing quite significantly large gaps. So for example, for wholesale, you have a gap of 1.2 billion. This is kwacha, compared to agriculture, which is around 89 million. And we see that across sectors, these gaps are also quite significant. But what the summary is here is that across all the sectors, we basically have significant leakages. And this slide here basically just presents that. The wholesale and trade retail, which is here, has the largest gap, and this is mainly because this sector is highly informal. 80% of Zambia's workforce is in the informal sector, and so a lot of leakages are hidden there. But what we also see is quite poor bookkeeping. Many firms are unaudited. You have missing reports, and of course there have been some efforts from the Revenue Authority around risk-based audits, but these are limited. We then also look at mining revenue. So mining quite significant for Zambia. It's basically the lifeline of our economy. Second largest contributor to GDP for Zambia. 2023 contributed around 13.7% to our GDP and almost half of the tax revenue. However, mining is really capital intensive in Zambia, despite being quite a large contributor. It only contributes to 2% of total jobs. And copper really in the mining sector is the largest mainstay, 90% of all the mining value and 73% of all foreign exchange earnings. However, what the evidence here shows us is that despite the high copper prices, revenue has remained suboptimal. There's a lot of informal miners and informal mining. The top 10 firms that are highly formalized pay 80% of mining taxes, despite having over 2,000 registered mining entities. And we see again that there are significant limitations here. When you compare that in terms of minority taxes outpace corporate income tax, which basically just shows that there are significant leakages here, issues to do with strategic pricing, transfer pricing, weak enforcement, shell companies. The mineral royalty taxes are basically quite difficult to manipulate because these are based on pricing. But when you see there are quite different disparities between the CIT and the mineral royalty taxes. So despite the growth in copper prices, this hasn't reflected in growth for the corporate income tax. And you see that there are also disparities in the data reporting between production and what is actually exported. And then we also looked at some options. In the earlier session, there was a conversation around this. We also looked at carbon taxation. What is the possibility of looking at carbon taxation in Zambia and introducing something around carbon taxation? We tried to model that on the South African model, basically trying to use conservative prices and rates from South Africa. But what we see is the highest potential for Zambia is from the agriculture sector, and obviously that's due to high emissions from livestock and land use. Electricity, transport, and manufacturing are quite limited, and that's very important for the discussion around jobs and inequality. Of course, for the agriculture sector, still quite significant concerns around inequality, because this is where most of the informal and vulnerable households are in terms of the economy. And then we also looked at tax expenditures, basically the exemptions. In 2022, Zambia lost around 5.1% of its GDP in tax expenditures. And ZRA has also made some progress around tax expenditure reports. We also looked at some evidence around taxing income and wealth, so making that more progressive. You see that personal income tax accounts for less than 10% of Zambia's total revenues. The other options were also to look at budget allocation, monitoring, and trying to ensure that we look at more efficient spending. Now, basically, with all these options, we came up with some figures, and the evidence showed that we could raise some additional resources, around 3.7 billion. So when we look at the recommendations from these various pieces of evidence, they could raise tax to equivalent around 35%, so could raise tax by 35%. And what we try to do is try to see whether we can push these resources into the social cash transfer program, and we used a fiscal neutrality, meaning all the resources used were basically put in the program. And what we see is we have a current baseline where households receive just 200 kwacha per month, and you have a top-up for all households that have disabilities. And eligible groups here are the elderly, persons with disability, female-headed households, and child-headed households as part of the beneficiaries of these programs. And so what we did was to have some simulations around potentially what this could look like. And we found that the most effective scenario would be to increase the cash transfer program, ideally to all households with children below the age of 2. And that showed that you could effectively reduce poverty by 1.64 percentage points, the poverty gap by 3.65. We also looked at potentially not changing the coverage, but keeping the same coverage, and that would increase the cash transfer value to around 434, so more than double. You see that poverty reduces by 1.32, consumption increases, and when you include a child benefit, for example, for all children below the age of 14, you see the poverty impacts. And when you expand the social cash transfer to all women, you see that there is a modest impact because mainly quite a number are already covered by this particular program. So on the last slide, what we basically show, and these are from the different pieces of evidence that we put together, is that with all these particular outcomes, when these resources go back within the social protection space, mainly through the social protection program, there's quite a significant significant impact on inequality, poverty reduction, and obviously some of the things around policy recommendations are to look at targeting households with young children, has the highest yields on poverty reduction, and scaling up the social cash transfer amount also shows that it could significantly improve welfare amongst the vulnerable, especially when combined with smart targeting. Thank you.